Well, I don't know if you've seen it or you've heard it, but there's an epiphany out there for you. Epiphany, in our context, refers to a season of the year, usually right after Christmas, the 12 days of Christmas, and then marks the Epiphany. So it began this past week. In which the revelation of God in Jesus, born in Bethlehem, is communicated far and wide to people who don't know the Bible stories. Okay, so the biblical accounts of Abraham and Sarah, including the one I just read, were not known to the original Magi, right, who are unnumbered, by the way. There are no three kings. They're Magi. They are wise thinkers who contemplate the stars and think that the stars bear signs for us human beings in human history. And they're unnumbered. But according to Matthew's Gospel, they traveled a long, long way from present-day Iraq and Iran, and they find the child in this most mundane place. Now, what's interesting about this revelation is that it is a very ordinary situation, right? It's a refugee mother and her newborn child, and there they are in this manger. That's all it is. But something sparks their imagination, and they recognize him as a unique figure. Epiphanies often do that. There's the ordinary, which is like a canvas, and upon the ordinary, there's something written or shown on that is extraordinary. On, shown on. The ordinary somehow becomes extraordinary. A deeper glimpse into the truth that once was hidden now comes into view. There is a more certain grasp of something that seemed to be slipping through our fingers. There's a sacred breakthrough, perhaps in the middle of a nervous breakdown. However we describe epiphany, the only way to comprehend the magnitude of an epiphany is to prepare yourself to receive one. And the only way to prepare yourself to receive one is, I think, to follow the example of what Abraham does in Genesis 18, which is he sits at the entrance of his tent. He sits at the entrance of his tent. You see, the entrance to a tent in that nomadic culture is a liminal space. It's an in-between space. It's like the doorway to a home, a threshold that holds back the thresh. It's like the parking lot of a store. It's like the icy sidewalk of a church. In those places, right, in those in-between places, things happen. Strange conversations take place. People slip and fall, and people are lifted up from the ground. Here's Abraham, who has passed his prime, and here's Sarah, who is barren like the desert. She has not born a child. They have food enough to sustain themselves, and they have livestock, they have servants. They will perhaps die in relative comfort because they have all the resources they need as a couple. And yet for Abraham, that's not good enough. He sits at the entrance of his tent. When three male figures approach and appear, the text says they appear. And this is the key, I think, to any epiphany. The appearance in liminal space, in between space. About a week before Christmas, I drove home from here and noticed the stranger knocking on various doors of our cul-de-sac. He was going from door to door, and I didn't recognize him. He seemed agitated. and a little panicked. He said, over the wind, I could hear him yell, "You met my wife!" What? You met my wife. I'm wondering, do you have a spare battery? 9-volt battery. A battery? I said, getting out of my van. I think so, and I'm starting to get a little suspicious. I met your wife. Do you have a spare battery? Hold on a second, right? And so I'm like, you stay out here in my driveway while I go inside and look for a battery. So I go inside and I take apart one of our many appliances and I find this 9-volt battery and I go back outside and he says, "Oh, thank you so much." And he runs back to this house and sure enough he gets into his house by putting the battery in the contraption that opens the garage door opener. And so began my first encounter with John, a name that means God's grace. John, who moved into my neighborhood with his pregnant wife, whom I had never met until that moment when he locked himself out of his house inadvertently. And what he told me after Christmas, a few days after he used the battery I pulled out of my appliance, was that he had left his newborn baby inside the house, and no one else was home. "Merry Christmas," he said, returning to me a package of new 9-volt batteries. "I'm so glad you came home when you did. I thought I was going to have to break a window." "No problem," I said, in that perfunctory tone of voice. "No problem." And I went back inside to play cards with my family. You see, it was a problem. I have to admit that, right? My first reaction was not, "Sure, I'll get you a battery," but was, "Who is this guy?" Right? My first reaction was, "You're a stranger. I don't know you." Again and again, I don't know if this is your first instinct, but again and again, it seems like in the past few years, I've been trained to kind of distrust the foreigner, right? The person who comes out of nowhere, it seems like. And maybe that's a good reason. There's a good reason for that. Maybe I'm just becoming less naive than I used to be. But it seems to me that I've lost something. With every random and distant face that comes close, with every spare battery we might have lying around in some drawer, there is a possible epiphany. And the question that I have for myself and for you at the beginning of 2018 is, will we be prepared to linger in that liminal space? I have a book in my office called Pastor is Minor Poet, and it's a book by Craig Barnes, who describes a pastoral visit he took with an older couple in his congregation. Jack was always scowling at church, and Betty had suffered a stroke and was experiencing symptoms of Alzheimer's. Jack and Betty had been married for many years. They had raised 3 children in a large mansion-type home on the hill. And they had been convinced by their now adult children to move away from that home. And so the couple found themselves in a strange place, in a 2-bedroom apartment with pictures from decades of their festive life, right, on the barren walls. And so Pastor Barnes went to see them for dinner, but Betty could not be allowed by the stove, and Jack didn't cook. And so he asked his housekeeper to make an extra large omelet before she left for the afternoon. When we were ready, writes Barnes, Jack put it in the microwave and then cut it into thirds and served it on Betty's best china. For dessert, they brought out Klondike bars, and we ate it with the best silverware. Now, I want you to consider that ordinary scene. I read that again this week, and it strikes me as quite ordinary. It's unlike the tabloid episodes that we read about in books like Fire and Fury, right? In books, that are so entertaining because they're so scandalous, right? Very ordinary things happening without much hoopla. Scowling, grumpy old Jack and oblivious Betty are now at the end of their days. For them, the best of life is over. Or is it? Craig Barnes goes on to say how after dinner, he felt so sad for this couple, he didn't know how to pray. He said he felt like he was a plane circling the airfield, looking for a place to land. But Jack sat down next to his wife, and he took her hand as if it were the first and the millionth time he had done it. He took her hand, and they both smiled simultaneously. And the smile said to Pastor Barnes, "Don't you dare pity us. Don't you dare. We're more blessed than you can possibly imagine." It was an epiphany. Epiphanies like that happen and have happened for 5,000 years. I want you to notice a couple things about the story of Abraham and Sarah. One is there are three mysterious strangers. But when they talk as one. Very interesting. And it's often referred to as the Lord said. And that suggests to me that God shows up in our relationships. God isn't just somehow, boom, in my head individually, but God shows up in our interpersonal relationships. The second thing is the hospitality that Abraham and Sarah show, right? Just hurry up, right? Here's a calf, right? Here's make cakes of flour. The hospitality that they show. And then finally, the surprise of Sarah, right? Who hears this news she's going to bear a child in her old age. And she laughs. Just yesterday, I did a funeral. It wasn't really a funeral. It was more like a wake at the Lantern Tavern on Perry Street. My son Ian has a friend named Jocelyn whose father died at 62, Bill Edwards. And Bill was a chef for many years. And this year, as he wasn't doing well, Ian said, could we invite Jocelyn and her parents to Thanksgiving? And we made a turkey, and Bill made a turkey with his wife Meg, and they came. And I had this marvelous conversation with Bill. And then a week later, I saw him at Jersey Mike's, and we both shared a turkey sub together. Again, this great conversation. And I got to know him just a little bit. And then just before Christmas, he died. And they invited me to kind of just set up the wake in which people would just share their stories of Bill. And this is what I learned. Bill made soup. He made soup, and he gave soup out, and he delivered food for Schwans. You know Schwans? And there were a dozen people who came up who said, this guy didn't just make soup for us. He talked to us. He listened to us. He encountered us. He took the time to say, who are you? This is who I am, right? And it was just a powerful moment, like each toast of IPA beer. And it wasn't just the beer. It was just this moment of the Spirit invading this space. And I tell you, there's something about that I don't want to lose. I can think all these great thoughts, and you can too. And I can develop what I think are great political solutions to the world's problems. But somehow the face-to-face encounter with living people over food might be the best, most fruitful impact we'll have.